We're here to talk about something that happened a couple of days ago, a ruling on the South China Sea by the Permanent Court of Arbitration. This whole conversation, I should say, is on the record. It's being videotaped. I think it will be put online. So I do want to clarify that. But we have a few people here who are excellently placed to talk about this issue. And it's a somewhat arcane issue. It's a legal case. But we will be discussing some of the aspects of it, both the legal aspects of it, perhaps some of the implications for how China in particular will respond to or might respond to it, and also the larger geopolitical implications, how it will shape the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific region. Also, I think we will hopefully get into this in the discussion. What are the implications of this ruling for India? Sitting here in New Delhi. And so I think we have one speaker who's coming a little bit late. He'll hopefully join us soon. But we'll probably get things up and running. I'll introduce our first speaker, Abhijit Singh, who is a senior fellow with the Observer Research Foundation. He's a former officer of the Indian Navy, and he currently heads up ORF's Maritime Security Initiative. So Abhijit will kick us off with a short presentation which will discuss some of the aspects of this ruling. So,
thank you.
I'll put it over to you.
Thanks.
You may want to check your microphone.
Check, yeah. I think so. Thank you so much, Dhruv. It's always a pleasure to be at Brookings. This decision that has come on the 12th has drawn a lot of attention. I'm quite aware that this is an issue that all of you by now might be quite conversant with. Maybe some of you are experts now at what's happening. So I'm not going to go over the entire case. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just give you a little bit of background, try and tell you about a little bit of history about the disputes and why is it that what's happened 3 days ago, 2 days ago, really has large implications, big implications for security in the region. I'm also hoping to touch on two aspects that I think are really interesting about this case. One of them is the legal strategies, the legal maneuvering that happened during the case, and why Philippines fought a really smart case. And why they probably outwitted China in the way they approached or fought the courtroom drama. And the second aspect that I wish to touch upon is that what the judgment does not talk about is just as important as what the judgment does talk about. So whilst it does look pretty bad for China from the outside, the fact of the matter is that on some specific details, the court has still left a few loose ends that can be exploited by China and that can deteriorate security in the region. So let me just come to my first slide to show you. This is, ladies and gentlemen, the South China Sea. The South China Sea, to put it succinctly, is the most important global thoroughfare. Almost 5 trillion worth of trade passes through the region every year. This sits at the crossroads of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Northeast Asia. This has huge reserves of oil, gas, and hydrocarbons, minerals, and also it is geopolitically contested between the US and China. So this really goes to the heart of China's conception of great power status. And it is absolutely important from a Chinese point of view to dominate this region. They see it as a critical little space. Now the conflict over the South China Sea actually dates back to 1945, just after the Second World War. But it had actually been lying dormant for many years, until 2009, when Vietnam and Malaysia presented the case to the Commission for the limits of the continental shelf to increase the limits of their continental shelf. That's when China objected to it. And China in 2009 filed a note verbal objecting to the claim. Since then, there have been a spiral of incidents. What the Chinese have done since then is that they have engaged in a series of provocative actions. It resulted in 2012 in the seizure of Scarborough Shoal, which you can probably see here. It's right next to the Spratly Islands. So Scarborough Shoal was seized by the Chinese, and then for about a year they stopped all the Philippines' naval and maritime activity in that region. They also imposed a moratorium on fishing activities in that region. The Philippines had enough of it in 6 months, and in January of 2013, they took China to court. And under Annexure 7 of the UNCLOS, Article 287, which calls for compulsory dispute resolution, the Philippines filed a case with the UNCLOS. What has happened since then is interesting. What were the Philippines submissions about? I won't take too long to just explain to you that the submissions were really not about territorial sovereignty at all. The submissions were essentially about three things. One, China's historic rights within the 9-line. And what the Philippines were objecting to is Chinese fishing activity, their hydrocarbon exploration, their island building activity, the fact that they were harvesting the sea life in that region. That was what the Philippines was objecting to. Secondly, the Philippines also sought a clarification from the court of the legal status of the features, the various small features in the Spratlys, especially close to the Scarborough Shoal and the Mischief Reef, which Philippines claims. And it was the Philippines' contention that none of these features were actually islands. The third most important submission was on the legality of Chinese civilian activities in the South China Sea. And what the Philippines objected to was that the Chinese had interfered with Philippines carrying out its normal easy activity in a space that actually belonged to it. So the Chinese had stopped their ships, they stopped their fishing, stopped them from doing hydrocarbon exploration. So these were the three basic submissions that were made. Now this was really smart strategy for two reasons, which is one, that the Philippines understood that at the heart of Chinese claims in the South China Sea is the legality of the little small features and entitlements that they generate. So if an island generates, or if a feature is deemed as an island, and it generates an entire territorial water, as you can see in this slide here, rather here, it generates an entire territorial water and an EEZ, or an exclusive economic zone, then by some Chinese calculations, they thought they were in a very good position to stake their claim over the entire South China Sea, 80% of the South China Sea. So essentially, the Chinese territorial claims also, in a manner of speaking, rest on the assumption that these features will at some point be granted the status of islands. Now what has happened is that when the court has ruled that no feature in the Spratly is an island, the Chinese claims have been hit quite hard. Now the Chinese realize that from the outside this is not to do with any territorial claim at all. From the outside, this is about historic claims in those waters, which the court has negated. But it actually goes to the heart of Chinese sensitivities about South China Sea, because de facto, this also rules out the possibility that these little features can generate territorial waters and EEZs. The other two things that the court says are equally interesting. One, the court rules the 9-line as an invalid basis for making any historical claims. It doesn't say so for the territorial claims, but it says so for the historical claims. And second, the court has ruled that China's actions within the Philippines EEZs were in direct contravention and a clear violation of what was there in the UNCLOS, and was also a violation of their obligations under the UNCLOS. So again, the Chinese activities in the South China Sea, especially in the EEZs of the Philippines, have received a clear indictment. I will show you the massive reclamation activities that have happened in the South China Sea, just to give you a sense of what's all the fuss about reclamation. This is what Ferry Cross Reef looked like in May 2014. That's what it looked like in January 2015. Quickly, this is again Ferry Cross Reef. This is what the Johnson South Reef looked like in 2014. This is what it looked 6 months later. And this is what it looked a few months after that. So if you can see, there's all sorts of...
Can you do that again, those last three? Yeah.
This is what it looked like in Feb, this is what it looked like in June of 2014, and this is what it looked like in January 2015. This is massive reclamation, and this is really a reef that has been converted into an entire island structure. But that brings me actually to my third point, is that what the court does not talk about is just as important as what it talks about. Take the case of Mischief Reef, for example. Now, Mischief Reef has been ruled as a reef. It does not generate an EEZ. It does not generate a territorial water. All it generates is possibly 500 meters of space around it. That's the only space the Chinese can claim to be their own. But the Chinese had made a claim to the court saying that Mischief Reef reclamation has happened for civilian activities. And the court took advantage of the fact that the Chinese had not declared military activities and passed a ruling. But in the case of the second Thom Shoal, which is with the Philippines, they have some military activity happening there. And the court said that because this military activity happening, we will not rule on this activity. Which really means that this is a pointer to the Chinese that if they can somehow show that their activities on these islands were military activities, the court would have stopped, would not have taken a call on that. So it's a lesson for China that the next time they go to court, they should not bring up the fact that they are doing only civilian activities and no military activities. Similarly, the court holds that the Chinese presence in the EEZ waters, in the EEZs of the Philippines is actually not a violation. The Philippines had submitted to the court that the Chinese presence in these waters, the military presence in the waters, is actually a violation of their obligations under the UNCLOS. But the court ruled that merely presence does not in any way go to show that they are violating it. So the other lesson for China is that even though their claims have been, their historical claims have been shot down, they can still send in their military ships into the EEZs and they can still be present in large numbers. The third big conundrum is about the implementation. There is no mechanism under UNCLOS actually to implement this ruling. The ruling can come out, but the court essentially depends on the goodwill and the rectitude of the members to be able to comply with the ruling. If China decides not to do so, there is nothing that really any one of us nations can do to make it abide by the judgment. What's also interesting is that China has actually ramped up its military presence ever since this ruling has come out, just in the past 2 or 3 days. Now this has an implication for freedom of navigation. It is for us to understand, and this was a point that the court did not go into, because the court under Article 298 cannot actually look at issues that concern either military activity or maritime delimitation. So the court's hands were tied, it couldn't go into it. But the fact is that if China decides to ramp up its presence in these waters, it in some ways establishes de facto control of this. They do not exercise their authority over the waters, but they have a de facto control. And so even if trade happens to that region, if military ships are passing through that region, it's all happening at China's sufferance. So again, the lesson for the international community is that this is a conundrum that is still not being clarified. In fact, now, the problem that a lot of us are going to face is that up until now, there were no Chinese naval ships in these EEZs. It was all the Chinese militias, which is the Chinese fisheries, the Chinese CMS, the marine services, and some other agencies that they have, the Chinese Coast Guard. Now, it is a situation of confrontation, wherein the Chinese are now sending in their naval ships, their submarines into the EEZs. So this, in a sense, also destabilizes the balance of security in the region. This is Gavin Reef that I was going to show you. This is Hughes Reef. This is how Hughes Reef has been built up in just the past few months. So my last point is really going to be that there is an implication here for all of us, and I know implications we're going to discuss later, all of this, but just from the point of view of freedom of navigation, access to the global commons, this is a much more volatile situation that we are in. In a few days, perhaps weeks, we might find a balance and equilibrium that might come in again, but I think this is going to be a more uncertain, a more volatile sort of equilibrium, and we need to see how the international community can sort of speak with China, get it to see reason, tamp down the tensions, and try and get things back to normal. I think I'll leave it here. Thank you.
I'll now turn to our other speaker, Darshana Barua, who is she's a research analyst with Carnegie India, who are Brookings and Carnegie are neighbors in Washington. We're close to being neighbors here now in Delhi. But Darshana has just finished a parliamentary fellowship in the Australian National University and has just returned back to Delhi. And she'll be, I've asked her to speak a little bit about some of the geopolitical implications of this ruling, what this means for the Asia Pacific and for the Indo-Pacific. So over to you, Darshana.
Thank you, Trevor. Well, China has refused to, abide by the ruling or uphold the ruling, so they have pretty much defied the judgment. So what this means for the region, so how is the international community going to react? And just kind of paraphrasing what the regional response so far has been, US, Japan and Australia have been the three countries who have clearly stated that the judgment is binding and that all parties concerned should uphold it. Other than that, Vietnam has welcomed the judgment but have not said anything. They said they're still studying the judgment and will come up with a more detailed statement. India has said that all parties concerned should uphold the principles and provisions of the UNCLOS. Pakistan's come on in support of China. We have regional institutions such as ASEAN has not made any formal statements, nor has the EU, but they have said that every nation, every concerned party should uphold international norms. So more or less the region has come out in support of UNCLOS. So from here, where does it go? What does it mean now, or how should the region react? There is going to be a bit of an action-reaction situation on the ground. Everybody was expecting, first of all, I think the judgment in itself has been something that was not expected. A lot of countries did not expect the tribunal to touch on the 9-dash line and other parts of the judgment, but the judgment in itself has been quite bold, so everybody expected China to react in a manner to lend credibility to its own stand that it's invalid. But China on ground has not done anything that drastic as yet. The expectation was also that the US would do something immediately, but that hasn't been the case either. But both sides have said that they are prepared to respond to each other's activities or any changes that goes on the ground. This brings the question of, like Kwan Singh said, that the tribunal lacks the power to implement this judgment. So who is going to really enforce this ruling? Is the Philippines going to stand up to China and say, withdraw your forces or dismantle your structures from this chief reef? Or are you expecting the United States to lead the way? The region is expecting the United States to lead the way, but the moment you talk about it, the other question comes in that, are you really expecting a country who hasn't ratified to the UNCLOS to enforce the ruling of the tribunal? So these are questions these are the debates that have come into play. There has been more or less been a bit of a calm approach from all countries. Even the Philippines, who's had a historic win on this judgment, has been fairly quiet on this, and there are reports that the current government, the Philippine president, is willing to hold talks with China, and China has indicated that China is indeed willing to see how this can be resolved at the bilateral level. This in itself, I think, has been an achievement because China so far was very adamant on his positions and he was not willing to revise any of his statements. So now it's willing to enter negotiations, but we don't know what kind of negotiation is going to happen between the two or has happened between the two. So far, I think on ground, the priority will be to stop or challenge further escalating activities like further construction on new islands or creating new baselines or sending military or militarizing these troops, because China has also said that it's within their right to establish an air defense identification zone over the South China Sea. And I would suspect that if China does establish an ADIZ, that countries are going to react and do whatever it takes to disregard that stand. So that in itself would immediately and very quickly escalate things kind of matters. China will, of course, going to lobby to keep this matter off all international organizations and institutions. There is going to be an ASEAN meeting end of this month in July. So what the ASEAN nation says and what they come up with, that would be critical. And China's always opposed internationalizing of this dispute, but then the fact of the matter is, this judgment, even if China said it does not matter and it's just a scrap of paper, their massive campaign to garner support and enlist nations in their support has kind of given away to the fact that it actually does matter to them, and they have quite a bit at stake. Yes, legally we still don't have any mechanism which can force them to abide by this ruling, but they're very concerned and wary of how the region is going to react, because it's no longer just about China and Philippines or China and Vietnam, because this ruling is going to set the precedence for norms of behavior and norms of behavior and dispute resolution mechanisms in future conflicts. So it's become a much more regional debate in itself. The point is no, the point here made is, I guess, that no one country can unilaterally come and change the status quo or try and attempt to change the facts on ground without any repercussions, especially in the multipolar world that we are trying to establish today. So despite the uncertainty surrounding the legality of enforcement of such a ruling on China, there has been quite a bit of effect. And there will be rifts as well if US does go onto the path of trying to enforce this judgment on China through its sails and in the South China Sea. Then it would also expect its friends and allies to come up and in its support. We don't know how many countries are actually going to, how sustainable that is going to be to keep continuing sending your forces to those waters to keep a check on what China is doing and where it is going. The other thing would be division within ASEAN, which we've already seen in the last couple of times, and that is going to go up because we have countries like Cambodia, and then we have countries like Philippines and Vietnam who wants to say something. So in 2012, for the first time in 45 years of its history, it could come up with a consensus. So maybe there's something that is going to happen again. So we're going to see rifts and divisions within the region, but this definitely sets the precedence for how things are going to go ahead in the region. The region I think, will also be looking at India as what India is going to do and what kind of a role it's going to play. Well, India said that it should uphold the norms of UNCLOS, but it hasn't said anything much. But I think we'll discuss a bit more about India in the question and answer round.
Thank you, Darshana. No, I mean, so my takeaways, at least from your two presentations, one, I think we've all been looking at what the judgment said, what the PCA actually said. A little bit like the dog that didn't bark at night, we have to think actually in terms of what they did not say and what the implications of that are. And I'm not sure too many people are thinking through all of that. The other thing that came across in both your presentations, I felt, was a lack of enforcement mechanisms, lack of implementation. So you now have this judgment, who's going to actually see it through? And that seems to be raising more questions than answers, more uncertainty. But I do want to open this up to other people quite quickly and have a discussion. But just in a moment, I want to start off by asking each of you a question, which are, what is the implication for India? I mean, a lot of what we're seeing, I mean, you are seeing some voices in the Indian media who say India should be sitting this one out. It doesn't really directly involve India. This is really between China, the Philippines, and the other countries directly involved. Why does this judgment manage India? Why does the South China Sea manage India?
That's an interesting question, Brooke. The South China Sea matters to India, I think, for three reasons. One is that about 40 to 50% of our trade these days flows through the Malacca Straits. So we simply have material and economic interests in the South China Sea. Plus, we also have some energy interests off the coast of Vietnam. So that point is clear to India that it simply needs to be taking a stand on what's happening in the South China Sea. The second, I think, more important reason is that India sees itself these days as an emerging power. It wants to sit on the high table. It has global aspirations, and in that it sees a responsibility to be able to take a stand on a matter of maritime principle. The days when when India could sit on the fence and say that because this doesn't concern me, because I have no dog in the fight, I'm just going to sit out. These days, there's a lot of pressure on India to take a stand on what it sees as if you want to be a member of the NSG and if you want to be a member of the UN Security Council, you need to take a stand on these issues. And India's stand is clear that anything that involves violence, that involves coercion, that involves provocation, unnecessary provocation, is not acceptable. And I think India has taken the stand that in some ways there should be a peaceful resolution to the problem, and that freedom of navigation under all circumstances should be preserved. For me, as a former naval officer and a maritime analyst, the most important consideration is that Chinese interests in the South China Sea have a direct bearing on their presence and power projection in the Indian Ocean. For India, it is important to realize that if China can cement its hold over the South China Sea, then it will be able to project power far more effectively into the Indian Ocean than it is doing presently. In fact, that is what the Chinese want to do in the next few years. If you look at their deployments in the Indian Ocean region, the submarines that they send in, the high-grade frigates that are now coming in, the amphibious warships that are coming in, it is very clear that they now want to master the art of littoral warfare in the Indian Ocean region. And so I think for India, it is important to strategically make sure that the Chinese are somewhat uncertain on issues of the South China Sea. So this is actually a welcome development for us. But it is also important for us not to show any triumphalism while this has happened. It is important for us to take a very balanced and measured approach, because we should be feeling no joy about China feeling some pain. It is important for us to not betray any anxiety over Chinese growing influence in the Indian Ocean region. But finally it comes down to this: material interests, matter of principle, and China's presence in the Indian Ocean. For these three reasons, I think India's position on the South China Sea must be clear and categorical.
I just want to ask you, Darshan, do you think what you described as a sort of fracturing in Asia that might follow, particularly if China was to do something like extend an air defense identification zone or something like that, how would that implicate India?
I think, that's an interesting thing, because we don't know if India is actually going to participate in an exercise which would actually, challenge that ADIZ. I mean, we didn't necessarily do anything when it was established on East China Sea, but with South China Sea, it does have implications, because that's the ground for our engagements with all of Southeast Asia and with China itself. The other thing is, I think for India to stay quiet on this matter was never an option, because India never took a stand on whether it was a fight between China or Philippines, but it was more of a matter of principle of international law. And I don't see how India could have afforded to undermine itself, because India accepted the tribunal's award in 2014 when the tribunal, gave a judgment against India with a dispute with Bangladesh. So if you would have not said anything at all, that would have gone a bit against what India has stood for. So the other thing which I found what for India was, in 2012, China had unilaterally called for international bidding on Block 128 of Vietnam's oil explorations in Vietnam's EEZ, where India was already present, disregarding the fact that India is already present. China had said it falls within my 9-dash line, so it doesn't matter if India is there or Vietnam is doing it. I'm still going to put it up for bidding. And India didn't say anything that time, and there was no, but that was disregard on India's relationship or India's presence in those waters. So it does have an implication on India and how India is going to look at it. And I think the other thing is, this kind of lays the ground of what kind of China is in the horizon. For us, how China behaves, how China reacts on this. It's going to give us an idea of how is China going to react and act on certain things in the international order, as well as India and China are only beginning to interact in the maritime domain. We have interacted much more in the continental borders, but this is only beginning. So it's important for us to get a sense of how China is going to play out, what things are going to go. So it does have an implication. With coming back to your ADIZ point, which is also going to be a regional expectation, is like, is India really going to physically, is India actually going to take on some of the responsibility in maintaining this, in enforcing this judgment by sending its ships or doing anything? I don't think so. India is going to do anything unless it's a more of a multilateral, like an ASEAN. But I think India is going to perhaps step up its own engagement with Southeast Asia, which is very much in line with Loki's policy. I mean, look, India does not have to do something saying this is in response to what has happened in the South China Sea. We already have a very strong foundation to increase our engagement in Southeast Asia, with Vietnam, with Philippines, and generally. So even if you step up your presence and increase that in itself is going to be a burden sharing, I guess, approach.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I just don't know if I want to little point on the ADIZ. You see, this ADIZ question is just being played up a little bit. It's very important to realize that at this moment, there's two debates happening in Beijing. The hardliners are arguing that we always told you that the Americans are going to get their way. In fact, they believe that this whole thing is being orchestrated by the Americans. And therefore, they think that it is important for them to send out these signals that they will set up an ADIZ, they will now begin to send their aircraft and set up air defense batteries on the Spratlys and the Parasons. But the other side is equally strong, and there is a view now in Beijing that such provocative action should not be taken because it directly impacts China's soft power image as well as China's commercial contracts worldwide. You see, a lot of these Chinese contracts all have arbitration clauses. This is an excellent point that was made by a Chinese scholar yesterday. And if the international community gets the impression that the Chinese can resort to provocation at the drop of a hat, think like an ADIZ, all of those contracts will come to naught. So they're extremely concerned about the fact that their image is being hurt. Plus, they also need market economy status under the WTO. And if China engages in things like this, their commercial interest, their economic standing profile is going to be hurt quite badly. So I think it's important for us to realize not to be discussing these things too much and not to be sort of extrapolating on the ADIs because the worst case scenarios might not actually come true.
I do want to give a plug that several of us, actually all three of us, will have articles on this. So if you are more interested in the subject and want some good bedtime reading, please. I think my article is available. But I think Darshana has a piece coming out tomorrow as well. We have let me take a few questions. I would just request that you keep the questions to a single question and the comments to a single sentence if possible. But please, you sir, and then I'll take the.
Let him go first.
Yeah. So this one. And by the way, if everybody could please introduce themselves so we all know who you are.
Thank you very much. My name is Captain Ayo Nukude. I'm Defense Advisor for Nigerian High Commission and also a Rhodes Ocean Scholar. Thank you very much for your very lucid intervention or talk. I just want to ask, I guess you're a hydrographer, possibly.
No, actually I'm a country officer.
Oh, okay. I'm a hydrographer, so it's an area I'm very intimate with. The Commission on Limits of Continental Shelf, at this time is taking in considerations for submission. I am a bit worried that this whole thing would impact very much on this year, the Commission of Limits of Continental Shelf. In terms of, when there's a problem of dispute, there's no submission. How is this going to play out, and would this affect the whole Article 76 claim for extension of continental shelf? I mean, what is the talk, or what's the theory about it? And again, from a Rhodes Scholar point of view, sorry, you said just one. This is also what at the Rhodes we try to worry about, because in '58, when the law of the sea first came up for discussion, and in '82, this whole loose ends were kept for people to be a bit pragmatic, not putting anybody in a stray box. So what kind of innovative measures could we take to solve this problem? Thank you.
Could you pass it down to the gentleman over there?
Okay.
No, sorry.
No. Oh.
Back over there. Yes, yes.
Sorry.
Hi, I'm Alex McLaren from the U.S. Embassy. According to NDTV, Chinese state-run media is identifying India as a supporter of China's position on this decision. I'm wondering, do you think, or how do you think the MEA should react to that?
And then a question back here.
Thank you. My name is Goya, retired Foreign Service Officer. Just one brief comment, because having served in China, I think, and first of all, Rashtra, I think I totally agree with you in terms of what Indian options are. And perhaps the safest route will be for us to go together with the ASEAN or the Southeast Asian grouping, etc., etc. I don't think that we can really be more direct in our involvement in the region. But just one brief comment, having served in China, first of all, the face saving, we may actually laugh at it, but it's a fact. When the Chinese are embarrassed, they are embarrassed. And in this case, they have been badly embarrassed by the ruling. Number two, they are also very practical people. They will know, there are several anecdotes, I will not quote them here, but they will know what is in the best interest for them in that. So considering all these things, I don't know, maybe as the time goes by, they will try and find a way to resolve the issue through bilateral mechanisms, talking within ASEAN, talking to Philippines, etc., etc. My question is, in this case, in case the situation comes to a point when this ruling has to be enforced, is it possible that this ruling could become the base of an international conflict or a regional conflict, which can then be used by some or the other to take it to the Security Council? I know that this ruling cannot be taken to the Council for implementation or reforms in that sense. But if it becomes the basis of a conflict, can it be or not? And how will the Security Council then react, considering that China is a permanent member?
So, 3 questions here. Abhijit, why don't you take the first one on the implications for the limitations of the continental shelf? I might take the second one, and Darshana, you can take the third, if that's okay.
Yeah, the CLCS claims, that's a very technical point. Let me just say one thing to you. In 2009, when this issue first played out, the reason why the Vietnam and Malaysia had submitted the CLCS claims was that the deadline was May 2009. And because the deadline was May 2009, there was pressure on them to put up the claim. But you see what's happened in all those years. This is a very contentious matter. I think in contested waters such as the South China Sea, maybe even some parts of the Indian Ocean, CLCS claims are going to be a cause of worry. So I think nations will perhaps be discouraged from doing that. I don't think whether I'm not so sure whether the CLCS will take this particular episode into account while ruling on these matters. But I think it definitely has a bearing on the way the claims are going to be put up. That is one. EEZ regime. Do we need a creative intervention, a creative interpretation? The EEZ regime was debated for 8 long years. And this is one of the voices in China now saying that we were on the wrong side of the EEZ. We should not have accepted the 200-mile principle at all, because we now see what that has led to. If we have claims in the South China Sea, and if EEZs were to extend to 200 nautical miles, we should have opposed this in the first instance, and we were perhaps wrong when this whole discussion was happening in the 70s, through the 70s and the early 80s on the EEZs. So the EEZ is a pragmatic balance between the interests of the coastal state and the interests of the user state. But it all depends on the goodwill of both sides. So if you look at Article 56 and 58 of the UNCLOS that actually talk about the respective rights and duties of the user state and the coastal state, there is a due regard principle. So you do whatever you have to with regard to the duties or with regard to the rights of the other state. Now, what's happened is that there is a differential interpretation of the due regard principle. The Chinese think that due regard means that if the Americans have to send in their ships, they must categorically approach us and notify us and take our permission before doing so. And we will allow them to do so. But the Americans believe that the due regard principle in Section 58, and correctly so, offers high seas freedoms in the EEZ. And if there's high seas freedoms, then you don't have to notify the other state. That one clause goes to the heart of this entire conflict. What's the due regard principle? And my sense is that your question, sir, the conflict part, I think conflict may not happen because it is in the interest of all sides not to have conflict. Let me also point out that in 1986, the US refused to abide by a decision by the PCA, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, in a case that involved the US and Nicaragua. And this was about mining in the harbor. And they even vetoed 6 Security Council resolutions to do so. It is not unprecedented for big powers to do so, but there's a very big difference. That was purely a bilateral issue. This involves the larger global community. It involves the interests of possibly every single state in the world. So for the Chinese to cock a stook at the law and then expect nothing to happen is a bit too much. I think there will be immense diplomatic pressure on China now to come to bear. But ASEAN, I think, is going to cut deals with China. And Duarte, who's the new Philippines president, has already shown signs that he's going to talk to China, try and cut a deal with them, which might undercut this whole decision, so to speak. But I think that would perhaps be the only way out of this problem.
I'll just take a stab at the question about the confusion, if you will, about Chinese media stating that India supported its claims. Some of this stems from the Russia, India, China statement, the RIC statement that was made following the meeting of the foreign ministers of those three countries. That statement did make a specific reference to UNCLOS. It also said that it was an issue to be resolved by the parties concerned. Now, that phrase, I suspect, led to different interpretations. China saw this interpreted as the same as parties directly concerned, i.e. China and the competing claimants, whereas I suspect India saw it itself as being a party for the reasons that Abhijit just spoke about, India being a party concerned in the case. So I think you had slightly different interpretations. There was some clarification subsequently made by Defense Minister Manmohan Parrikar on this issue. And then, of course, on July 12th, the day of the release of the award by the PCA, India did issue a statement the same day, and I think the statement rather speaks for itself. So I mean, I suspect up to you and up to Beijing to see whether India's statement actually is tantamount to siding with China on this issue. But I'll leave it at that. But Darshan, you want to take the last question? Will this actually lead to confrontation if it comes down to enforcement of
I think there could be confrontation, but I don't think so it's going to escalate to the point of an international conflict or an international crisis. Because like Manu Singh pointed out, it's not in anybody's interest. China doesn't want to fight right now, US doesn't want to fight, India definitely doesn't want anything. But so it's definitely not going to get to that point. I mean, and even if it gets to that point of international crisis as we would expect, I think it will be, by then it will be beyond the realm of UNSC or anything else. Then we are looking at a different, order that we are looking at. And because with UNSC, with the veto power, how do you go ahead with that? So, but I don't think so China is actually going to get it. There might be still few confrontations, but what happens on ground next, that is going to be critical. What China actually decides to do as a reaction to this judgment, to say that this is how we are, putting forward a foot, saying we don't respect the judgment, and what the region responds. But it will depend on the magnitude of the reaction, what happens.
We take another round of questions, including, if people are vaccinated. You, sir, then you. Anybody else? We'll take one more. Nobody? I'll ask again. So.
Thank you. Ranjit Rai. Abhijit, I'll be very brief with you. Hit the nail. Commodore retired Ranjit Rai. You hit the nail on the head. Military matter. And you use the word dog, which is on that thing. It's not the dog, it's the fight of the dog. China won't go down. Why? Very briefly. WWW, India Defense Forum, has done a study. It's 479 pages. It's argued every island, it's argued everything. So what you did not mention, and you did mention that Article 298, which clearly says when signing, ratifying, acceding to the convention at any time after a state may, without prejudice to the obligations arising under Section 1, declare in writing does not accept any one or more of the procedures if it is concerning military matters. Now, I agree with you what you said on other, but you did not mention Taipei. Taipei is an island of Taiwan, which has got military on board. It has got a C-130 landing.
I had that on the slides.
You missed it. You normally don't miss. Okay. So this WWW, India Defense Forum, quite clearly tells you. And what surprised me, Taiwan has sent a warship. Now, if Taiwan and China get together, Taiwan asked to be party to this, but she was not allowed. Only Malaysia, Indonesia. So that is one very big point which will come up. And the second part, of course, the ambassador has raised, It says, if disputes concerning military activity it carries on, I won't go into details, and it goes to the Security Council, which we've been talking about, then UNCLOS has nothing to do with it. On COC, it says quite clearly, it's dying down. Singapore's got nothing to do with it. Laos and Cambodia have deserted the ship. I don't think Indonesia, it says, I don't think Indonesia or Malaysia or Brunei will go to UNCLOS. Finally, it says, India was told 1 week ago, China knew this decision, America knew this decision, that free navigation will never be stopped. When we question them, why have you brought a submarine in? They said free navigation to Indian naval ships will never be stopped. And 5 days ago, they told Philippines, why don't you come to the table? So Article 59, equity, they will have to sit down and decide. And there's a map of how much China loses by this decision. So I want you to comment on typing.
Hello, I am Siddharth. I am researching in Jawaharlal Nehru University. In context of this verdict on South China Sea, I would like to ask that how do you see the future of rule-based international order? And second thing, you talked about certainly Chinese growing involvement in Indian Ocean region. But I would like to ask that if we talk about implication on India, then will this Chinese assertiveness will have any bearing on India-China land border also in settling land?
So, why don't you first take the question on Taiwan? You mentioned it briefly, Darshana, that the Taiwanese statement on this, but...
Thank you for pointing out typing, sir. I feel so miserable I missed out that point. But let me just say this. In the run-up to this very interesting case that was held at the PCA recently, there were 2 islands that were being discussed, not just by the Chinese, even by the Philippines, the US, and the others. Mischief Reef and Taiping Island, that's right. Now, Taiping is the biggest island in the Spratlys. And Taiping is under Taiwan. And Taiwan had a couple of months back made it clear that it did not respect, or rather it did not acknowledge this whole case because it involved a decision on the status of Taiping. It considered Taiping to be an island. Taiwan considers Taiping to be an island. The US and Philippines had calculated that Taiping might be with Taiwan, but you see, this is one nation, Taiwan, China. And in effect, it is a Chinese enclave. It's a Chinese position. Somehow, the court had to pass a ruling that shows Taiping to be a rock. Now, what has happened, very interesting, sir, is that is exactly what the court has done. I'm not casting aspersion on the court. I'm saying it's not like the script was written by somewhere else. The court has rightly held, and this is interesting here. The court said that there's 2 things that are required for a feature to be ruled as an island. One, it needs to be able to sustain life, natural sustainable life. And second, there also has to be a measure of economic activity happening there. The Philippines had submitted that only if one of these things does not happen, it should be deemed to be a rock. But the court held that both of these conditions should be true. And the court held under that Taiping actually is a rock. If Taiping is a rock, that has huge implications because then it means that every single feature in the Spratlys is a rock. Nothing generates more than 12 nautical miles. And that is the point I was trying to make. That in effect means that China actually does not have any territorial claims over that water because none of them generate an EEZ. Mischief Reef was declared as a reef, which means now the Chinese have an installation on Mischief, the Taiwanese have something on Taiping, but none of these 2 structures can be adequately protected because the court's ruling has now shrunk that zone around these 2 islands to just 500 meters or 12 nautical miles. That's on Taiwan.
Just for clarification, I mean, it was on habitation in a natural state.
Yeah, habitation in a natural state.
So all the reclamation does not count, basically.
Right.
Do you want to address the issue about the rules-based international order?
I think that's pretty much the core of the debate, rules-based order.
I have a follow-up question. I mean, related to that, which is, if China has actually signed and ratified UNCLOS, the court has determined that because it has done so, the PCA has jurisdiction over this issue, although China disputed that. So they claim that they did have jurisdiction and have now ruled against China. does that mean, what does that mean for the future of China within UNCLOS? I mean, this is an element of the larger question. If you could address that, that would be.
It is about rules-based order. I mean, I think this entire ruling and judgments made quite a bit of dent in China's, peaceful rise and, its establishing a rules-based order on what it's advocating is where it wants to be a great power. So it definitely has made a impact, and diplomatic pressure is going to go up. There's also this other debate that China might withdraw from UNCLOS as an extreme reaction to show that it's not justified. But I don't think so. China's going to end up doing something that drastic. It does not serve China's, because it's just saying, because China till now is still, even in its statements, it's saying that we abide by international law. But this particular ruling is saying it's out of its jurisdiction. So it's contesting UNCLOS and international law only just on this one. At the same time, it's saying that we're pretty much within the realm of UNCLOS and international law. Like, similarly, I don't know within UNCLOS if this is definitely, if China goes ahead, maybe this is going to be the precedence for how China is going to interpret UNCLOS. With UNCLOS, there has been in history, there's been different interpretation of laws within UNCLOS, and this was one of the cases where it was more about interpretation of law rather than just on sovereignty issue. Your second question on if it will have a direct impact on India-China border issue, I don't think so. There will be a direct impact from the ruling on the border issue of India and China, but it does have to give India a sense of what kind of China is there, like I said. And also the other thing is, if India, I don't think so, India will decides to join the Americans or the Australians and set up votes or do something, then there could be some sort of pressure along a border, or maybe like one of the things said in the ocean, they could send more ships, send something to border, or in Pakistan, that's how there would be pressure on India. But India has not really taken a side. It's maintained a distance of taking a side from the beginning. It's taken a stand on the matter of principle of international law. And I think if it goes ahead with its balanced stand, I don't think so they should have any kind of an impact directly on a land border.
I just want to get rid of that.
That's a very interesting question you asked. And let me just say this to you. You see, there's two things in international law that's interesting. One is, that are relevant. One is that, do you follow international law, as the laws that are signed by treaties and the formal treaties and even bilateral understanding engagements? And the other is customary law. So in a lot of cases, for example, I'll give you a small example. In the case of the US, they haven't ratified the UNCLOS, but they almost follow all the provisions of the UNCLOS. And their reasoning is that a lot of these provisions have to do with customary law. But on one provision, which is with the reason why they didn't sign the UNCLOS, which is the continental shelf and the mining that they were doing, the drilling activities that they were doing on the continental shelves, that they considered to be a customary activity. It was under customary law they could do it. And they still believe that that's a reasonable principle. The Chinese often quote that to say that, look at the Americans, they haven't signed it, they think they have their own customary law. The historic right is our customary law. But the thing about freedom of navigation is that is, if freedom of navigation is recognized both in international law as well as in customary law. And if the Chinese try and prevent that by, threatening any of the shipping that's happening in that area, as is being speculated now, they will be in clear violation of both customary as well as international law, and the Chinese don't want that to happen. So I think Darshana is right when she says that she doesn't see conflict happening, but Chinese are very aware that this is a very volatile situation. This can come back to hurt them very bad if they get too provocative. They will be slightly more provocative because they're at this moment in time trying to. But you are right in saying that this hurts the entire international rule-based system. It now has gone beyond UNCLOS. UNCLOS, after this, believe me, has no role to play at all in what happens. This is the most they could do. They could only rule on historical rights. They could take no call absolutely on, and they have done that. From now on, it will all be UN Security Council, as you rightly say, and there China has a veto. China has a veto.
Take another round of questions and comments. I think so. You have one. If you just wait for the microphone. And if you could please introduce yourself as well.
Hi, my name is Rohit Baina. There's an article which has come online on ET, quoting Beijing media, where China is calling US and Japan as paper tiger and eunuchs and saying it's given orders to its army to be ready for counterattack if the US sends its warships in the South China Sea. So while we are talking about that we don't see a conflict happening, China is giving orders to its naval forces to be on standby. What would you like to comment on that? I mean, that's just out from Beijing. And But I also somehow see, while this may be some radical stance that they may take, eventually I don't think a conflict it's going to boil down to a conflict. More, I think ASEAN countries is something that they can really play a role here in putting economic pressures on China. See, the whole problem in China, the Chinese economy, the way in a state in which it is, there are a lot of industries which are wanting to close down and move out of China, and they are not being allowed to do so. That's another fact of matter which is happening today. Today, nobody who is making huge losses in China is being allowed to shut down his plant and because of loss of jobs. So they have an option. You can just forget about your entire investment and walk out of there if you would. That's one option available to you. Otherwise, you're not allowed, officially you're not allowed to shut down your plant. The only way they can do it is if ASEAN countries starts to pressurize and more anti-dumping duties all across starts to come out and economic pressures are built on China. That's the only way to get them to a talking table to resolve this matter like this. Because mainly ASEAN countries are affected.
Thank you, Dhruv. I just want to make a comment. I think one point that needs to be remembered.
Sorry, so for everyone's benefit, if you could introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. Admiral Arup Singh, retired from the Navy. I think one point that needs to be remembered by all of us is that Philippines was actually very, very smart, and it was smart because it had done a lot of homework. It didn't happen overnight because of the Scarborough Shoal incident. It started from 2008 onwards, in fact even earlier. And therefore they were preparing very well. Why did it ask the court to rule on the status of maritime features? The point to remember is that since UNCLOS, a pinpoint island, if it is declared an island, hypothetically, generates an EEZ of 430,000 square kilometers by our square, 200 nautical miles. That was the worry not only of the Philippines but the entire world, including India, America and everybody else. One. Two, the Philippines was also very smart in asking for declaring whether the 9-dash line has any basis in a manner which would not hurt even the PC. Because it used the terminology historic rights and said, can the court please declare whether it is true that there are historic rights to this 9-dash line? It did not ask a direct question, so that the court doesn't say that there has no jurisdiction, because anything to do, first of all, the 9-dash line has no basis in international maritime law or international law, because insofar as UNCLOS is concerned, land dominates the sea. A line which is a maritime zone or where one claims sovereignty over the water has to have its attachment to a baseline on land, which is where China has faltered through it. Lastly, I would like to make another comment on, so far as a lot of questions have been raised about, firstly, over the last couple of months, will India join, not join, including during the Raisina Hill. We are very clear. We are not a Pacific resident power. We have no business to be going into joint patrolling with anyone. We've told the Americans, we've told everybody else. If we were a disputant, it would have been different. If we were a resident power in the Pacific, it would have been different. However, if our interests insofar as our trade through the South China Sea or JVs with Vietnam, Petro-Vietnam or Sakhalin or wherever else get hurt, we will send in whatever resources are at our. Thank you.
So, question.
I'm Dilip Sinha, former diplomat. A question, I think, Abhijit, you said. Yeah. A question to you. You mentioned that Philippines is possibly looking at some possibility of backward talks with China. What kind of compromise do you think Philippines could be looking at with China on this issue?
Why don't we take those three? So actually, when you start with the last one, just because it was addressed directly to you.
Yeah, sir, from what I hear is that the new President Duarte is not keen to show China down in any way, and he's looking for ways in which either the space, the common spaces, maritime spaces can be jointly developed. This is an old Chinese idea. Deng Xiaoping had first made this idea of developing the spaces mutually. And from what I hear, they're even talking of sharing the maritime boundaries, rather the common zones, the maritime zones. I don't think that will be acceptable to many ASEAN countries, which is the other point, that ASEAN on how to take this forward with China appears to be divided. Philippines now that it has this emphatic victory, is doing a rethink on whether it should press China fully or whether it should compromise, because it has a lot of interests in China. There's lots of trade dealings, economic activity that happens. But on the other hand, the US, the Australians, as well as some other nations, Vietnam and the others, are putting pressure on Philippines to make sure that they don't give an open leash to Beijing. So I am actually on this question not sure what's going to happen. I just know that there's divisions at the moment, but China will definitely take advantage of these divisions that exist between the two sides. And on your question on the paper tiger, I think this rhetorical frenzy will continue for 6 days more. After that, it's a little bit like what is that? When you pray, 6 days of frenzy and penance, and then everything comes okay. So I think
the Philippines, the trade that they have with China,
Yes.
whether it's Philippines, whether it's Indonesia.
I think Darshana wanted to address that point, so if you could just, if you want to.
Yeah, with the same, it's like, this is rhetoric, but the other thing is also, I think China somewhere has to also cater to this nationalistic sentiment that they're fanned through this entire South China Sea issue, where, they feel like they need to set right what has been done wrong to them after, over the years by the great powers. That's something they have to cater to, that's a domestic thing, and that will happen. And like I said, I think they probably are ready to do something if they think something is, where they see there's a threat to what they consider is right, but it's going to depend on, they're also aware that if they do something like that, which is going to be considered very assertive, there's going to be responses and reactions, so they're going to be very calculated on their part as well.
Actually, the Dai Bingguo, who is effectively the de facto foreign minister previously in China, gave a speech about a week or so ago at Carnegie, in fact, in Washington, where he said that even if the US sends all 7 aircraft carriers into the South China Sea, China will not back down. So very sort of bombastic rhetoric coming out of Beijing. And in fact, just recently, it's quite interesting to see some of the rhetoric. The Chinese vice minister, in fact, the foreign ministry said, sort of implied that the judges were unduly influenced, which was, it was sort of interesting for him to say that in a public setting. So we are going to see this rhetoric. But in terms of economic levers, I'm not sure anybody on this panel will be the best people to answer that. But if you want to get,
I just want to get to a point that the Admiral made. I think a very, very interesting point. And I actually wrote an entire piece on this that how the Philippines nailed the case was that they did their homework to the T. They did to the T. And the really important thing that they did is 2 things. They did a lot of hand holding of the court. In 3 sessions before the real hearing, the court had to satisfy itself under Article 288 that they can take up this case even though one side has refused to participate in it. And the Philippines made sure that on every single point they convinced the court that this was well under their jurisdiction and that they should take it up. So I think they did that very well. One of the things that hasn't come for discussion really, the Chinese grand strategy, the idea was to use straight baselines around the Spratlys and then claim land. The Philippines has even gone to the extent of getting a ruling from the court on the court that straight baselines are not allowed because this is not in China, is not an archipelagic nation. But guess what? That has bearing for us because our Andamans also have straight baselines, and we are not an archipelagic nation.
Do one last round if anybody wants to ask a final question, comment.
Does it affect our claim on Kachikivu?
All right. Okay. So that
historic claim.
that's perhaps a discussion to be had over coffee and tea. If you could please join me in thanking our speakers, Abhijit and Darshana, for coming here.